It was another ordinary evening on a busy city street. The sun had just set, casting long shadows across the pavement as the hum of the crowd echoed in the air. People walked by, some in a hurry to get home after a long day of work, others simply enjoying the evening air. Among them was a man dressed in a sharp suit, his tired face reflecting the stress of a busy day. His name was Thomas, and he had just finished a meeting that left him feeling drained. His stomach growled, reminding him that he hadn't eaten in hours. He decided to grab a quick meal at a nearby diner before heading home. It was a small place, with neon signs flickering overhead, and the smell of sizzling food wafting from the door as he pushed it open. Inside, the diner was cozy. The sounds of clinking dishes and quiet chatter filled the room. Thomas found a booth near the window and sat down, letting out a sigh of relief. The waitress came over quickly, ready to take his order. He looked at the menu, his eyes tired, and finally decided on a simple meal, a burger and fries. The waitress nodded and walked away, leaving Thomas alone with his thoughts. Outside, the street was filled with the usual noise, but one figure stood out. An old man, dressed in ragged clothes, sat slumped against the side of the diner. His hair was unkempt, and his face was covered with a thick layer of dirt. His eyes were closed, but his hands rested on a small cup in front of him, gathering coins from the occasional passerby. His face looked weary, as if life had been hard on him for years. Thomas glanced at the beggar for a moment, feeling a twinge of annoyance. It was rare to see people like him anymore, and Thomas was tired. He didn't want to deal with a stranger begging for change. Still, his eyes lingered for a moment longer before he returned to his menu, trying to push the thought away. A few minutes later, the door to the diner opened again, and the beggar shuffled inside. He moved slowly, cautiously, his eyes scanning the room. The other customers didn't seem to notice him as he approached the counter, hesitating for a moment before asking the cashier, "Can I get something to eat? Just enough for a meal." The cashier looked at him, her expression cold, and said nothing. The beggar stood there for a long moment, looking down at his hands. His stomach rumbled, but he didn't have enough money to buy anything. He glanced around, his gaze eventually falling on Thomas's table. Thomas watched as the beggar's eyes met his, and for a moment, their gazes locked. Something inside Thomas shifted. He wasn't sure why, but without thinking, he reached into his wallet, pulled out a few bills, and handed them to the beggar. "Here," he said, his voice quieter than he expected. "This should be enough for your meal." The beggar blinked in surprise, and then a smile spread across his face. "Thank you, sir. You don't know how much this means to me." With shaky hands, he took the money and went to the counter to order his meal. Thomas watched him for a moment, feeling both puzzled and strangely moved. The beggar had no idea who Thomas was, but his kindness had made a difference. For Thomas, it was just a simple act, something he had done without a second thought. But little did he know, this small gesture would soon change both of their lives in ways he never imagined. As the beggar walked back to his corner table, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about him. There was a strange sense of connection, even though the man was so different from him. The beggar seemed grateful but not overly emotional. He simply sat down quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he unwrapped the meal. Thomas tried to push the thought away, telling himself it was just a good deed, something anyone would do. But for some reason, he couldn't stop thinking about the beggar. He wondered where the man had come from, and why he was in such a poor state. Was he always like this, or had something happened to him? Something that left him in this unfortunate position. The meal was quiet, and Thomas tried to focus on the food in front of him, but he kept sneaking glances at the beggar, who was eating slowly, savoring each bite. It was clear he hadn't had a good meal in a long time. The way the beggar ate, almost as if he were in a hurry to finish, made Thomas feel a little guilty. He had so much, and yet the beggar seemed so thankful for such a simple gesture. As he ate, Thomas heard murmurs from the other tables. Some customers were talking about the beggar. They were curious, wondering who he was. Thomas overheard snippets of their conversation, but nothing stood out. Everyone was focused on the meal, or their phones, or whatever else had brought them into the diner. But for some reason, the beggar seemed to attract attention. Maybe it was his appearance, or the way he had walked into the diner so quietly. The murmurs grew louder, and Thomas couldn't ignore them. He tried to pretend they weren't talking about the man, but the whispers were hard to miss. The beggar didn't seem to mind, though. He just kept eating his meal in peace, unaware of the attention he was drawing. He looked up only when the waitress brought him a drink, and he nodded in thanks. It was simple, but polite, and Thomas couldn't help but respect that. After a few minutes, Thomas finished his meal and stood up to pay. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the beggar. The old man seemed so calm, so content, despite everything he had been through. It made Thomas wonder about his own life. Was he really as happy as he appeared, or had his busy, stress-filled days left him feeling empty? As Thomas walked up to the counter to pay, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of admiration for the beggar. He didn't know why, but something about the man's quiet dignity had stirred something in him. Maybe it was the simple fact that the beggar hadn't asked for much. He hadn't begged, or cried, or pleaded for sympathy. He had simply accepted the kindness offered and moved on. Thomas paid for his meal and grabbed his jacket. Just before he left, he turned back to look at the beggar one more time. The old man was still eating, his face peaceful despite the struggles he must have faced every day. There was something about him that Thomas couldn't explain. He had given him money, but now he was starting to wonder if the beggar had given him something, too. Something he hadn't expected. A reminder of the importance of kindness and gratitude. The next day, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the beggar. He hadn't expected the encounter to affect him so much. Normally, he would have forgotten about something like that, but this time it was different. There was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, like he had missed something important. He couldn't explain it. As he went about his day, the memory of the beggar kept popping up. He kept wondering who the man really was. Could he be someone important? Maybe a once successful businessman who had fallen on hard times. Thomas tried to push the thought aside. After all, it was just a beggar, but something about his eyes made Thomas feel like there was more to the story. Later that afternoon, Thomas decided to visit the local cafe, a favorite spot of his where he often went to clear his mind. It wasn't far from the diner, and he thought he could use the time to relax and take his mind off work. As he entered the cafe, the sounds of clinking cups and soft conversations filled the air. He ordered his usual, a cup of coffee, and sat down by the window. As he sipped his drink, he overheard a conversation at the table next to him. It started as just background noise, but as he heard the words, something caught his attention. The two people were talking about the beggar he had seen the night before. "Did you hear about the old man?" One of them said. "They say he used to be someone big in the business world." Thomas's heart skipped a beat. The words felt like a sign. He leaned in closer, trying not to be obvious as he listened. "They say he lost everything. His company, his reputation. It all fell apart after that scandal a few years ago." The second person continued. "He's been living on the streets ever since. It's sad. Really, he was once a millionaire." Thomas's mind raced. Could this be true? Could the beggar be the same man they were talking about? He tried to remember the name that had been mentioned, but it was unclear. Still, the pieces seemed to fit. The beggar's worn clothes, his quiet dignity. Perhaps it was all a cover for a deeper, more painful past. As the conversation at the table went on, Thomas couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: shock, disbelief, and even a hint of admiration. The man who had once had everything, now reduced to asking for a meal in a diner. It didn't seem possible. But somehow, hearing this story made the beggar seem more real to Thomas. He wasn't just a homeless man asking for help. He was someone who had lived a life full of success, failure, and hardship. And now, he was just another person, like anyone else, trying to survive. The conversation ended, and the people at the next table left. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that he had just learned something important. The beggar wasn't just a figure on the street. He was a man with a history, with a story that had been lost in the shadows. Thomas stood up, feeling unsettled but more curious than ever. He left the cafe and walked back toward the diner, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't sure why, but he felt like he had to learn more about the beggar. There was a part of him that needed to know what had happened to him. How had someone with so much lost it all? And could he still be saved? The next day, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about the beggar. He was still trying to understand why he felt so connected to him. Everything he had learned about the man from the cafe conversation only made him more curious. He decided he would find out more. There had to be something more to this story. Thomas spent the day researching. He started by looking up any news about the beggar. It didn't take long before he found something that made his heart race. The name from the cafe conversation matched an article he found online. It was about a former business tycoon named Richard Hayward, a man who had once been the head of a well-known company. The article talked about his sudden fall from grace. Richard Hayward had been a millionaire, known for his successful business ventures and philanthropic efforts. He had built a company from the ground up, making a name for himself in the business world. But then, everything had changed. A scandal involving his business dealings had shattered his reputation. He was accused of fraud, and soon after, his wealth disappeared. Richard Hayward had disappeared from the public eye after that. No one knew what had happened to him. Some people believed he had gone into hiding, while others assumed he had simply given up on life. But no one knew the truth, until now. The article ended with a mention that some believed he had ended up on the streets, living as a beggar. Thomas stared at the screen, his mind reeling. Could this be the same man? Could the beggar he had seen in the diner really be Richard Hayward, the once famous businessman? He found it hard to believe, but everything seemed to match. The appearance, the quiet dignity. Thomas couldn't ignore the possibility. Feeling a mix of disbelief and determination, Thomas decided to return to the diner. He needed to see the beggar again, to be sure. As he walked down the street, his thoughts raced. What would he say if he saw Richard Hayward again? How would the former businessman react if he knew that someone had figured out who he really was? When Thomas entered the diner, the familiar smell of food filled the air. He scanned the room, looking for the beggar. Sure enough, there he was, sitting at the same corner table. He was eating his meal, as calm and peaceful as before. Thomas hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do next. He walked over to the counter and ordered a coffee, his eyes still on the beggar. As he waited for his drink, he couldn't help but wonder how Richard had ended up like this. What had happened to him after the scandal? What had pushed him to the streets, where he now begged for food? Finally, with a deep breath, Thomas decided to approach him. He couldn't ignore the growing need to know the truth. Slowly, he walked over to the beggar's table. Richard looked up, his eyes soft but tired. Thomas stood in front of him, unsure of what to say. "Excuse me," Thomas said, his voice steady but full of curiosity. "Are you Richard Hayward?" The beggar's face froze for a moment, his eyes widening slightly. He said nothing at first, but then he nodded, a sad smile forming on his lips. "I was once," he said quietly. "But that man no longer exists." Thomas sat down slowly across from Richard, still processing the shock of hearing the man confirm his identity. Richard Hayward, the man who had once been a powerful business leader, now reduced to a shadow of himself. The transformation was almost too much to believe, but here he was, sitting in front of Thomas, looking worn and weary. Richard didn't speak at first. He just stared at the table, his hands folded in front of him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words. Thomas wasn't sure what to say. He had so many questions, so many thoughts racing through his mind. He wanted to know everything. Why Richard had fallen so far, how it all had happened, and most of all, what had become of the man who had once been so full of life. Richard finally broke the silence. his voice low but steady. "I used to be someone, you know. I built an empire. People respected me. They listened to me." His eyes met Thomas's, and for a moment, they both sat in quiet understanding. But one mistake was enough to tear it all apart. Thomas listened carefully, feeling a deep sense of sympathy for the man sitting before him. He could see the weight of Richard's words in his tired eyes. "What happened?" Thomas asked gently. "How did it all go wrong?" Richard let out a long sigh. "I trusted the wrong people," he said, shaking his head. "I was too focused on success, on proving myself. I didn't see the lies creeping in. I didn't notice how the people I relied on were taking advantage of me." His hands trembled as he spoke, the pain of those memories still fresh. "By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. My company collapsed. My name was ruined." Richard paused, looking away for a moment as if trying to block out the memories. "And when you lose everything, Thomas," he said quietly, "you find out who your real friends are. The truth is, I didn't have any. Everyone turned their backs on me. I was left with nothing." Thomas was struck by the sadness in Richard's voice. He had expected anger, perhaps even bitterness, but instead, he heard nothing but regret. There was no pride left in this man, just a quiet sorrow that seemed to have taken over his life. "But why?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. "Why stay out here like this? Why not fight to get back up?" Richard met Thomas's gaze, and for the first time, a faint flicker of something, almost like hope, seemed to pass through his eyes. "Because," Richard said softly, "sometimes it's easier to stay down than to keep fighting. It's not about giving up. It's about knowing that even if you try again, you may never get back what you lost. So I chose to live quietly, to fade into the background." Thomas didn't know how to respond. He could see the pain in Richard's words, but at the same time, he felt a strange sense of admiration. Richard hadn't given up completely. He had simply withdrawn, choosing the simpler life after losing everything. The conversation hung in the air, but Thomas couldn't help but feel that he had learned something important. He realized that it wasn't just about the money or the fame. Richard's story was about the fragility of success, the dangers of trusting the wrong people, and the difficulty of rebuilding after everything is lost. After a long silence, Richard finally spoke again. "Thank you," he said quietly, looking at Thomas, "for the kindness you showed me. I don't think I could have taken another night on the street." Thomas smiled softly, feeling the deep respect for this man who had been through so much. "I didn't do anything special," he replied, "but I'm glad it helped." The silence between them stretched for a few moments as Richard looked down at his half-eaten meal. It was almost as if he was gathering his thoughts, trying to decide whether he wanted to share more of his past with Thomas. Finally, Richard looked up again, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and relief. "You want to know what happened after all that?" Richard asked, his voice quiet but steady. "You want to know why I ended up here, on the streets?" Thomas nodded, feeling that the moment had come. He was eager to understand, to hear the full story, but at the same time, he didn't want to push the man too hard. He knew it couldn't have been easy to relive everything. Richard took a deep breath. "After the company collapsed, I was lost. Completely lost. I thought I had everything. Money, respect, a future. And then, one day, it was all gone." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "You see, when you lose your business, you don't just lose money. You lose your identity. People forget who you are. They stop looking at you as someone important." Thomas could hear the pain in Richard's voice. He could see the way the memories still weighed on him, how they shaped everything he said and did. It made Thomas realize that this wasn't just about a financial downfall. It was about the loss of something far more important, his sense of self. Richard continued, his voice growing softer. "After the fall, I tried to reach out to some of the people who had been close to me. I thought maybe they'd help me pick up the pieces, but no one wanted anything to do with me. They were too busy protecting their own reputations, making sure they didn't get dragged down with me. Thomas's heart ached for the man sitting before him. He had never experienced anything like this. He had never been in a position where his whole world had been taken away. It was hard to imagine how someone could go from being at the top to living on the streets. "So what did you do?" Thomas asked, his voice quiet. Richard gave a small, sad smile. "I wandered. I had nowhere to go. I had no money, no friends, no home. I didn't even know where to start over. I ended up here, on this street, and for a long time, I just stayed there, asking for help, hoping someone would give me a chance." "But why didn't you fight harder?" Thomas asked, his brow furrowed. "Why didn't you try to rebuild your life?" Richard looked at Thomas, his eyes full of understanding. "Because sometimes it's not about fighting. It's about letting go. Sometimes you have to let go of the past and accept that some things can't be fixed. I've learned it the hard way." Thomas was quiet for a long time. He had never thought about things in this way before. He had always believed that with hard work, anything could be fixed. But Richard's story was different. It wasn't about hard work or starting over. It was about accepting what had happened and finding peace in the aftermath. "I never expected kindness," Richard continued, his voice low. "Not after everything I did. But you, Thomas, you were different. You didn't look at me with pity or judgment. You just saw me as a person." Thomas felt a lump form in his throat. He hadn't realized how much his small act of kindness had meant to Richard. It wasn't just about giving money or food. It was about seeing him, truly seeing him, and offering something no one else had: respect. Richard looked down at his meal, then back up at Thomas. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I didn't think anyone cared anymore." Thomas smiled softly. "Everyone deserves a little kindness," he said quietly. The conversation between Thomas and Richard seemed to slow down as both men sat quietly, each lost in their thoughts. The weight of everything Richard had shared hung in the air. Thomas couldn't help but think about his own life. He had always been focused on his career, on climbing the ladder, on making more money. But now, sitting across from Richard, Thomas realized how fragile everything could be. One moment, everything is secure, and the next, it could all disappear. Richard broke the silence, his voice calm but determined. "I know I've made my choices, Thomas. I know I've failed in so many ways. But I'm not ready to give up just yet." Thomas looked at him, surprised. Richard, the man who had seemed so resigned to his fate just a few moments ago, was suddenly speaking with hope in his voice. "What do you mean?" Thomas asked, his curiosity growing. Richard leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe I've been hiding too long. Maybe I've been too scared to face the world again. But after you helped me, I'm starting to think maybe there's still a chance. Maybe I can start over. Maybe it's not too late." Thomas felt a spark of inspiration. He had never expected to hear those words from Richard, the man who had once been at the top, only to fall to the lowest point. He had thought Richard was too far gone, too broken to ever rebuild his life. But now, sitting in front of him, Richard seemed different. There was a glimmer of determination in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "I'm glad you're thinking that way," Thomas said softly. "It's never too late to try again. Maybe you don't have to rebuild everything, but you can find something new, something that makes you happy." Richard looked at Thomas, his expression thoughtful. "You really think so?" he asked, as if he wasn't sure he believed it himself. "I do," Thomas replied. "Sometimes the hardest part is taking the first step. But once you do, you might be surprised at what you can achieve." There was a long pause, and Richard seemed to be considering Thomas's words carefully. Finally, he nodded, as if he had made up his mind. "You're right," he said, his voice steady. "I've been living in the past for too long. Maybe it's time to let go of all the regret and fear. Maybe it's time to start fresh." Thomas smiled, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. He had been so focused on understanding Richard's past that he hadn't stopped to think about his future. It was clear now that Richard still had the strength to make a change, even if it seemed impossible. "You don't have to do it alone," Thomas said. "If you need help, I'm here. You've shown me that kindness matters more than anything, and I want to return the favor." Richard's eyes softened, and for the first time, Thomas saw a real sense of hope in his expression. "Thank you, Thomas," Richard said quietly. Maybe I can finally move forward. Maybe I can find a way to live again." The two men sat together in silence for a moment, the weight of their conversation settling into their hearts. It wasn't just about helping a beggar. It was about seeing the potential in someone who had almost given up. And for the first time in a long time, Richard Hayward believed that he could change his life. Maybe it wasn't about finding everything he had lost. Maybe it was about finding something new, something worth living for. As the minutes passed, the noise of the diner faded into the background. Thomas and Richard were no longer just two strangers passing through life. They were two people who had shared a moment of understanding, of hope, and of the belief that it's never too late to begin again. The days passed after that conversation, and Thomas couldn't help but wonder how Richard was doing. He had offered his support, but Thomas didn't know what had come of it. Was Richard really going to try again? Could he truly rebuild his life after everything that had happened? Thomas wasn't sure, but he hoped with all his heart that Richard would find a way. One afternoon, Thomas was walking down the street, lost in his thoughts, when something caught his eye. He paused, looking down at the corner where he had first met Richard, the very same spot where the old beggar had been sitting. To his surprise, there was no sign of Richard. Instead, standing on the sidewalk in front of the diner was a well-dressed man, talking to a couple of people and handing out flyers. It took a moment, but Thomas realized who the man was. Richard. But he wasn't the same Richard Thomas had met weeks ago. The man before him was clean, dressed in a sharp suit, and looked completely different. His hair was neatly combed, and there was a spark of confidence in his eyes. He wasn't the broken man who had once begged for a meal. He was standing tall, proud, and doing something completely new. Curious and amazed, Thomas walked over to him. Richard turned at the sound of footsteps, and upon recognizing Thomas, broke into a wide smile. "Thomas, I didn't expect to see you here," Richard said, his voice full of warmth. "Come, have a seat." Thomas couldn't believe what he was seeing. He sat down next to Richard, still trying to process the change in him. What happened?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with amazement. "You look different." Richard chuckled, nodding. "I feel different too. It's been a long road, but I'm finally doing something with my life again. I've started a small business, helping other people who have fallen on hard times. It's not much, but it's mine, and I'm proud of it." Thomas felt a surge of joy for Richard. He could see the pride in his eyes, the kind of pride that had been lost when everything had come crashing down. Richard was no longer the man he had been, and that was a good thing. "That's amazing," Thomas said, genuinely happy for him. "I'm so glad you're doing this. You really have turned things around." Richard nodded, his smile growing even wider. "It wasn't easy, but I had to fight for it. I had to take that first step, just like you told me. And now I'm helping others who need it. I want to make sure no one else ends up on the streets like I did." Thomas felt a deep sense of admiration for Richard. This was the man who had once lost everything, but now he was giving back. He was using his past as motivation to help others. It was truly inspiring. "Well, I'm proud of you, Richard," Thomas said. "You've shown me that no matter how hard life gets, there's always a way to rebuild. It's about taking that first step, no matter how small it seems." Richard smiled warmly, placing a hand on Thomas's shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without people like you. Your kindness gave me the strength to keep going, and now I want to pass that on." Thomas nodded, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. He hadn't just helped a beggar that day. He had helped someone rediscover hope and a new purpose in life. And in turn, Richard was now helping others, just as he had promised. As they talked, Thomas realized that this moment, this unexpected meeting, was the beginning of something much bigger. Richard was no longer just a man who had fallen from grace. He was a man who had found his way back. And in doing so, he had found a new purpose, one that would help others who needed it most. It wasn't just about money or success. It was about kindness, about offering someone a chance when they needed it most. And in the end, that was what had made all the difference. Weeks passed since that day Richard had started his small business, and Thomas found himself thinking about him often. He had seen Richard a few more times in the neighborhood, always with a bright smile and a confident stride. The man who had once begged for a meal was now a symbol of resilience, someone who had picked himself up and was building something meaningful from the ground up. One evening, Thomas received a call. It was from Richard. The voice on the other end sounded excited. "Thomas, I've got something to show you," Richard said. "Meet me at the cafe in 30 minutes. I've got something to give you." Curious, Thomas agreed and made his way to the cafe. He had no idea what Richard was talking about, but he was eager to see how things had progressed. When Thomas arrived, he spotted Richard right away. He was sitting at a table near the window, wearing his usual sharp suit. But this time, he had a large folder in front of him. Richard waved enthusiastically when he saw Thomas approach. Sit down, Richard said, motioning to the seat across from him. "I've been working on something, and I think you'll be happy to hear about it." Thomas sat down, his curiosity growing. "What's all this about?" Richard smiled and opened the folder. Inside were papers, some with numbers, others with plans. "This is the start of something big," Richard explained. "I've been working on a project that's going to help people who've fallen through the cracks, like I did. I want to create a foundation, a place where those who have nothing can get the help they need to start over." Thomas was speechless for a moment. He had always known that Richard had a good heart, but now he saw the full extent of his vision. Richard wasn't just thinking about helping a few people. He wanted to make a lasting difference, to change lives, just as his life had been changed. "That's incredible," Thomas said, his voice full of admiration. "But why me? Why are you showing me this?" Richard leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Because, Thomas, you were the first person who showed me kindness when I had nothing. You didn't know who I was, but you helped me anyway. That was the spark I needed to get back on my feet. Now, I want to offer that same spark to others. I'm hoping you'll be a part of it." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He hadn't realized how much his simple act of kindness had meant to Richard. It was humbling to hear that he had made such a difference in someone's life, someone who had so much to give. Richard pushed the folder across the table. "I want you to be a part of this project, Thomas. You don't have to do anything big. Just be there to support it, to help me guide it in the right direction. You've already done so much, and now I want to offer you the chance to help even more people." Thomas looked at the papers in front of him, then back at Richard. It was clear that this wasn't just about business or charity. It was about changing the way people saw the world, about giving second chances, about offering hope. And Thomas knew he couldn't turn down an opportunity to be part of something so important. "I'll help," Thomas said, a smile spreading across his face. "I'll do whatever I can." Richard smiled back, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas. Together, we can make a difference." As they sat together in the cafe, talking about the future and the possibilities ahead, Thomas realized something important. It wasn't just the help that mattered. It was the kindness, the trust, and the willingness to see people for who they really were, no matter their past. That was what had changed Richard's life. And now, together, they would help change the lives of others. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but with hope, determination, and a little kindness, Thomas knew they could achieve anything.